We still face basic questions. Do you have a country that welcomes talent from around the world or shut them out? Do you have a country that supports business and the free market or seeks to greatly curtail that? Are you prepared to raid your citizens' pockets for much more money to pay for a much bigger state or not?
Welcome to Politics Where Next, the first of what we hope will be a series of podcasts talking to people who've been thinking about where on earth our politics is taking us. And I'm joined today in his own office by George Osborne, formerly the Chancellor, now the editor here of the London Evening Standard. Thank you for joining us. Can I start with where next on austerity? Because we sit here just the week after Theresa May announced to the Tory party conference, it's over. Is it over?
Well, first of all, welcome to the Evening Standard, Gary. I'm delighted to be part of this podcast. Look, there are always going to be issues in politics of what you can afford and what you're prepared to tax people to pay for. And they were the issues I faced as Chancellor. Of course, I faced them at a time when we had a huge budget deficit. We were in the immediate aftermath of a massive financial crash. And for a variety of reasons, not least, I think, because the government I was part of did a good job, the current Chancellor and other future governments will not face those same financial pressures that I face. So, I think to compare the fiscal situation now, the budget situation now with the budget situation in 2010 is a mistake. It's different. And even when I was in the final years as Chancellor, I was starting to ease off the tough decisions we were having to take, not just on public spending, but tax too.
But there's a whole load of cuts that you outlined quite a while ago that still haven't been found, for instance, on welfare. Were they ever truly, did you ever truly think you would find all those welfare cuts? I think they found something like 4 billion out of 12 that you said would have to be found.
Well, the primary purpose of what we were doing in that coalition government was trying to get the public finances back into order. Remember the famous letter, there was no money left, and Britain, like other European countries at the time, faced potential fiscal crash on top of a financial crash. At the same time, we were seeking to reform welfare, and I think one of the successes of that government, wasn't solely down to me, there were other people involved, of course, was to actually change our welfare system to encourage people into work, and Britain's got very low unemployment, I think in part as a result of what we did then. But look, I'm not in the government now, I'm not in the Parliament, I'm not sitting around the cabinet table, and it's got to be for the people who are doing the jobs I used to do to make decisions now about what they think is right for the country, and that's up to them. And the Evening Standard and other media outlets will take a view.
There are bigger issues here, aren't there? You remember the days not so many years ago when people used to say, what's the Labour Party for when the money's run out? And right now people are beginning to think, I hear Tory MPs talking about what's the Conservative Party for if there isn't any more scope to cut back and it's the end of austerity. Maybe there isn't much scope for tax cuts.
Well, first of all, there's an ideological argument about how big the state should be, how low taxes should be. That was quite different from the situation I faced as Chancellor, which was a sort of emergency situation where the country had run out of money and we were facing, a potential economic disaster. And that's why actually we managed to create a broad consensus, not just in the Parliament, but of course in the country, because we got re-elected as a Conservative government. I think there's going to be always in a Western democracy a debate about how much you're prepared to pay and what are you going to get in return. So the big challenge in the National Health Service is always going to be what can you afford with a, quite rightly, a free at the point of use NHS. And I think issues around technology are going to come to the fore because, frankly, this whole debate that you can tax the country much more is, in my view, a bit of an illusion. If you look at the history of British politics over the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, the 2000s, through Labour governments as well as Conservative governments, you find that the country will not really tolerate a level of taxation much above 40% of GDP, and in fact just below that as a proportion of the economy. And that was true under, as I say, left-wing governments as well as right-wing governments. So it's, you've been asking me about austerity. I tell you, the most difficult times I had as Chancellor politically were not about public spending cuts, they were about tax rises. And they were the problems that I ran into, like previous chancellors, on, pasty tax and, when I was trying to tax wealthy people who weren't paying income tax, that suddenly became a charities tax. These were the real political trouble I, found myself in and had to reverse out of. And I suspect, for all this talk, that you could suddenly find, many tens of billions of pounds more for the public services. The truth is, it will be difficult under any government to find the tax base to do that.
So those Tories, some of them in government, some on the backbenches now, who are saying we've got to turn the taps on, you think that's going to be a pretty limited project in scope?
We're not in a period of severe fiscal constraint like we were after the financial crash. So, it's no surprise that Philip Hammond, my successor, who for many years was my deputy when I was in opposition, is easing up. I mean, I was easing up in the last couple of years as Chancellor in terms of the fiscal path. But, and there's nothing, absolutely fixed in stone or ideological about a particular rate of any one tax, like national insurance, which has been talked about. I'm talking about the broader picture, which is, can you in this country very substantially raise the tax to GDP ratio? Well, Labour governments in the 1970s, Labour governments in the 2000s didn't manage. I doubt, even if they wanted to, a Conservative government now would be able to do so. And, we would see if there was a future Labour government if they were able to. But
well, that's one of the questions.
There is, Britain finds itself in the sort of middle of the pack of Western societies with, roughly in the middle levels of public spending and taxation. You can have day-to-day, year-by-year political debates as budgets come about what, where exactly you are on that in that scale. But the idea is there's a fundamentally new model out there. I'm a bit sceptical.
Maybe, though, a new appetite amongst some voters who've got bored of austerity, strained by austerity, with the benefit of being outside the political front line now. Do you detect any of that? I mean, that's what a lot of people read into the last election.
I mean, if you're saying the country's sort of bored or, frustrated with the lasting impacts of a financial crash, yeah, sure, so am I. I mean, it's not like I, wish the country to have to deal with this enormous financial crash, which, now with the benefit of a bit of a hindsight, 10 years hindsight, we can now see was one of the biggest economic shocks this country has ever faced in its modern era. So, of course, memories fade, but particularly in a hung parliament, it will be a courageous government, let's put it that way, who pushes ahead with big tax rises. In any case, I don't think that's what this Conservative government wants to do. It wants to keep the country competitive. I certainly don't think, by the way, that there's some sort of Brexit bonus, which you get some people talking about, because every international observer of the British economy, the domestic observers of the British economy, including the Office for Budget Responsibility, which I created, have all made the observation that depending on the kind of Brexit deal, the country will either be very much less well off or just a little bit less well off than it would otherwise have been, depending on the exact nature of the Brexit and the relationship with the EU going forward.
But that's one of the central arguments of the government at the moment. Maybe one of the reasons Theresa May unveiled end of austerity in her speech. She wants to lure those potential dissidents in the Tory party who are thinking of voting against any deal she comes back with into her pen, voting with her on the promise that actually there could actually be then a little bit of give in the Treasury sums, and we could be at the top level of expectations in the fan chart over what the city and other businesses are expecting from Brexit, and there will be more revenues as a result. You're saying that's a false...
No, I'm saying that
sum.
The idea that Britain is better off for leaving the EU, I just don't believe it, nor does anyone, almost no one credible believes that. So there's a question of how much worse off are we than we would otherwise have been, and that's all up for debate and all dependent partly on the outcome of these Brexit negotiations. But there are some various sort of fundamental features of British politics at the moment which you should just pay attention to. First, we are still, of course, in the tail of the impact of a massive financial crash. Second, new technology, social media has changed and disrupted the way we do our politics. Third, Brexit is far and away the biggest and most difficult administrative and economic task the country has undertaken, and completely understandably swamps and dwarfs everything else. And then fourth, the government doesn't have a majority. And there's nothing, you can go back in the history books, governments that don't have a majority find it extremely difficult to pass things through Parliament, let alone very contentious things like Brexit. So the reason we're having this, this is the day-to-day stuff of our politics, is for a very simple reason, which is they don't have the votes.
Well, we might come back to austerity, but let you bring it on to Brexit. As you stand back again, benefit of this distance that you now have, running a newspaper, can you think of any phenomenon quite like this in terms of the proportion of people implementing Brexit who think it's a bad idea at every tier of government, maybe? Can you think of anything quite like that?
Well, it's certainly a very unusual situation. I can't think of an immediate parallel where the country is undertaking a course that the vast majority of MPs, members of the cabinet, civil servants feel is not the course the country should be undertaking. Now, that's not the same as saying there are lots of members of the cabinet who voted Remain and think we have to respect the outcome of the referendum. But if you ask sort of from first principles, do they think it's a good idea that Britain's leaving the EU? No, they don't. But they think, many of them, that it would be a mistake to try and reballot that, and go back to the public. It's also just an enormous task. I think it's what people have come to understand, that it's not some sort of simple act of just leaving. This goes to the heart of how you run your economy, what your security relationship is with your neighbours, what the unity of the West looks like to the rest of the world, down to really kind of microscopic issues of how you regulate your pharmaceuticals and what's the standards you apply to your car parts and the like. And because it consumes everything, because we've been part of this organisation for 50 years or thereabouts, it's proving a huge task for the British state. I mean, right at the sort of limits of what the British state can undertake, and the British state is got more capacity than most.
Some of Theresa May's rhetoric when she first took over might have made you think that she was heading for a different kind of negotiated settlement from the one that she seems to be trying to land things in now, a more distant relationship, maybe the rhetoric suggested. Do you think she was always going to end up where things are now? Let's assume it's something like the Chequers deal that ends up agreed with the EU. Do you think the forces would always take any Prime Minister there?
Well, Theresa May can defend herself. I think what I would say is what Brexit, the aftermath of the referendum and the Brexit negotiations have revealed is really two things. One, that the promised land from the Brexiteers was certainly not immediately available. Some are now saying it'll all be all right in 50 years' time, and it's worth enduring some hardship between now and then. I'm not sure the rest of the country are quite as phlegmatic as they are about the next 50 years. Second, that the reality of taking back control, as they would describe it, means having to decide what your immigration policy is, what your trade policy is, what your state aid policy, i.e. can you intervene in the economy. All of these things, when it actually comes to the crunch, if you want to turn away more migrants, there's an impact on the economy. If you want to intervene in propping up business, there's an impact on public finances and less money for the NHS. If you want to do some trade deal with America or China, well, great, that means you're going to have a lot more Chinese and American goods coming into the country. Are you ready for that? And so it's the sort of reality of these things that is beginning to bite. And as a result, what the political system is doing, what the or the cabinet is doing is just putting it off, these decisions. We've not actually taken any decision in Brexit. The only decision we've taken is the delay. So originally it was, we were going to leave immediately, then we were going to leave in the spring of 2019 and exit all the EU regime, and for a period we were led to believe that actually the government didn't want a transition deal. It was happy to leave in 2019. Now it wants a transition deal. Now the latest rumour is it wants to stay in the customs union until at least 2022. It's a never-ending process of putting off the hard decisions of what life is like outside the EU. Now, from my point of view, with good reason, because these are all unpleasant or harsh outcomes for the UK. So I'm very happy that they keep being put off, and we essentially are leaving the room where the decisions are taken, but still going to adhere to the EU decisions. Some people say it's the worst of both worlds. I don't agree. I happen to think it's not as good as being in the EU, but it's certainly better than leaving the EU's economic orbit altogether.
Would you support a second referendum?
Well, my view has been we have to basically get on and respect the outcome of the referendum. That doesn't mean I don't think the country can change its mind, and I'm certainly keeping a kind of close eye on the growing clamour for a second referendum. But I note it hasn't yet reached the point where either the Labour Party leadership or the Conservative Party leadership are ready to endorse it, and therefore has no prospect of going through Parliament at the moment. That might change over time. But what I also think is that a 52-48% outcome of that referendum was never going to be a mandate for a hard Brexit, a complete separation off from the EU and its single market, its customs union. A better way of approaching the aftermath of the referendum, in my view, would have been to say, how do you bring this country together? This is a vote to be outside of the EU, but closely aligned with and associated with the EU. That's what the country has voted for, rather than the attempt to kind of claim winner takes all, which some of the hard Brexiteers went for, and as a result, I think, have created a very divisive or exacerbated what was already a divisive situation, and may not actually get what they set out to achieve in the first place.
And maybe you might think some born-again Brexiteers who were originally Remainers went too hard line in the aftermath of the referendum as well, Theresa May included, perhaps.
Well, the central task, political task, after the referendum result was to try and bring the country together, not split it further apart. And in a way, the failure to do that was reflected in the general election result, where the government lost its majority.
That sounds pretty much parked at her doorstep.
Well, look, I'm not any more a Conservative politician. I'm just a newspaper editor.
Yeah, all the more reason to share your thoughts.
They are regularly shared in the op-ed columns of the Evening Standard, freely available around London and online.
You look ahead, can you see this destroying or significantly setting back your old political party? When you think of, for instance, if there were to be a leadership contest in the future, surely it's going to be all about where do we actually go on Europe, given we've deferred the decision. Isn't the party just going to be as split as ever, maybe more split in the future by this issue?
Well, when I became a Conservative MP in 2001, and then I'd worked for the Conservative Party before that, there was always a debate about whether we embraced modern Britain, diverse Britain, whether we were socially progressive or not, whether we were economically sensible rather than ideological. It doesn't feel to me like those debates have hugely gone away. They kind of ebb and flow.
It just looks like your side is losing now, doesn't it?
Well, it certainly felt like the last couple of years the Conservative Party was moving to the right. But I note we just had a party conference where quite a lot of people were falling over themselves to stress their affinity with modern, diverse Britain. And the new, younger generation of Conservative leaders, many of whom I know and worked with me, and are going out of their way to stress that the party is pro a more modern Britain and not trying to take us back to some sort of nativist past. If it ever existed, I don't think it did.
But your grassroots and
the
activists and some of the people you're pulling in the 2017 general election, those are people with what is sometimes called a more sort of closed outlook, not as open to the world and globalisation, technology, and the rest of it?
The Conservative Party members, certainly the ones that I came across and in my local constituency party in Cheshire, were very good people who wanted the best for society. But they also want to be led, and it's up to the political. There's no point blaming the foot soldiers. It's the generals and the officers of the army who have to take responsibility. And I think there was a real debate in the Conservative Party about the direction we want to go in. I think in the end the country does not want to be presented with a choice between the sort of Corbynites and the hard Brexiteers. I think there's a big space in the middle. We're sitting in the constituency of Kensington here, this is where the headquarters of the Evening Standard. Sort of inconceivable that Kensington would have anything other than a Conservative MP, but it does. It has a Labour MP. And the fact that the Conservatives lost in Kensington, in Reading, in Canterbury, in Bristol, in Bath, in Oxford, these are growing towns that are some of the most successful parts of the British economy, some of the most successful parts of the world economy. Of course, as a Conservative Party member still, I would like to see those towns represented by the Conservative Party in Parliament. They are not at the moment, and there's a reason why, because we decided to, as a party, run against Metropolitan Britain, and Metropolitan Britain, as a result, ran against us.
And do you see that long-term, potentially, opening up the way for a different force in British politics?
Who knows is the sort of short answer, because here we are having this conversation, and if we'd been having it 2 or 3 years ago, we would never have guessed that Jeremy Corbyn was leader of the Labour Party, Jacob Rees-Mogg was the power in the Conservative Party. Things change quite dramatically in political systems. That said, I think it's unlikely that there's going to be some new party or some new force, because the barriers to entry are quite high in British politics. It's difficult to create a new party and difficult to get yourself elected. And B, a much easier path, a path of much less resistance, is to either in the Labour movement, and we haven't talked much about that, but either in the Labour movement or in the Conservative movement, make sure it's heading in a more centrist, modern, progressive direction. And whether that's Labour Social Democrats taking back control of their party from the sort of hardline left, or in the Conservative Party, moderate, modernising Conservatives taking control of the direction of that party, we shall see. But that strikes me as a more, an easier way forward than going out and creating some new political party.
You've been a student of the left and Labour, trying to understand it as a phenomenon all the way through your adult life. Where do you see it? Because in some parts of the world, we've had new forces on the left coming up, Podemos, Syriza. Here we've had the left taking over a party that used to be an adjunct to. Social democracy not in good health in many, many parts of the world. Do you think actually there is this sort of well of social democracy out there, or something has fundamentally shifted?
I think the old post-war political model has been shattered. Now, what has shattered it? Partly, I think, the economic crash. I think an economic historian would have no problem looking at this period of European and American politics and saying, hold on, you had one of the biggest shocks to your economy outside of the Great Depression, and of course that's created a reaction in political systems where people feel the system didn't deliver for them, or they lost out, or they were cheated, or whatever. That's the first thing. Second, we've had an incredible period of technological disruption, and every time there's a new thing like a printing press or a television invented, it totally changes our politics. We've had social media. Third, maybe linked to those two things, there's definitely been a realignment of politics along a kind of more a kind of cultural axis, if you like, rather than the economic axis. So, the Conservative Party can win a seat in Stoke-on-Trent, but lose a seat in Kensington, which would not have happened when I started out in politics. And you see that, I think, in what's happened in the Labour sort of coalition. If you think of the Labour Party as always a coalition between the white working class in industrial towns and the kind of Hampstead intellectuals and sort of young urbanites, that feels, both in Britain and in other places where the left has struggled, to be fracturing. Now, where all the kind of new pieces of the chessboard are realigned, we shall see. But I guess I stick with what I certainly believed in when I was active in politics, which is if you put forward sensible propositions about a free market economy within constraints that funds public services, and that you are open and modern and progressive and internationalist, that's the place to be. By the way, it's all the right. Forget about the political tactics. It's what I actually happen to believe is the right thing for the country.
But it's possible people aren't listening. It's possible that things have changed, that crash, the magnitude of that crash was so big, we could be at the end of the first chapter of a not very nice book.
Well, it's certainly the case that I think if you assume it's all going to revert to some old normal, that's probably not going to happen. I mean, it does feel to me like a whole era of politics that I was part of has passed, the kind of Clinton, Blair, Cameron, Obama period. And politics is done in a very different way, most obviously by Donald Trump, but there are other big disruptors out there like Emmanuel Macron, who's completely changed French politics, and for the first time since the Second World War there's neither a classic conservative or socialist in power in France. But that doesn't mean that just because the political alignments have changed and the sort of old party structures are straining, does not mean that the ideas of we still face basic questions. Do you have a country that welcomes talent from around the world or shut them out? Do you have a country that supports business and the free market, or seeks to greatly curtail that? Are you prepared to raid your citizens' pockets for much more money to pay for a much bigger state or not? There's not some new set of questions. I think, if anything, those questions have been starting to reassert themselves. And again, I come back to what I always believed, which is modern, pro-business, socially progressive, internationalist politics is the right thing for Britain. And the alternative extremes of sort of shutting the door to the rest of the world, as the sort of hard Brexiteers would like, or going into a sort of socialist utopia, as I guess the Corbynistas would like, is not good for the country. And in the end, the people who will suffer are the people who are least able to cope with that, the poorest and the most vulnerable.
There will be people who hear you say, I was part of this generation, politics seems to have moved on. And they will say, well, actually, it was your generation that created all the problems that caused the new dispensation where people are angry and fighting the system. So you might want to unpack this, but they might come up with the attacks on welfare, the liberalisation of rules for the city, the weaponisation of facts in political discourse, let alone being a bit anti-European when the rhetoric suited and all the rest of it. These were problems that you might occasionally wake up at 3 a.m. and think, well, actually, I had a bit to do with this.
Well, we certainly made mistakes. I'm not for a second pretending we didn't. And I think the immigration rhetoric was too harsh. We should have stressed the benefits of immigration. I think when it came to Europe, every politician, left and right, used Brussels as the kind of kicking post, when of course many of these issues were about how we want to run our own society. But that said, I was part of a government that created jobs, saw the economy grow, was able to fund public services, saw outcomes in those public services improve. And all I would say is, if you want to tear down the system, and if you sort of scream at your population, what the hell have you got to lose? The answer, peace, prosperity, and progress, is a hell of a lot. Those are the things we're at risk of losing. And let's remember, in our world and in our society here in the UK, over the period of the last few years running up to the referendum, our society became more equal. We recovered better than many from the financial crash. Our health outcomes were improving. Our crime rate was falling. Now, some people might say it's not enough and you need to make society fairer and there are still businesses that need better regulation. Yeah, sure. But what's the risk is we're tearing up the foundations of a free and open and successful market economy, and I'm talking about across the West here, and that is a really dangerous thing to do. And because we don't know what's going to take its place, but it could be a lot worse.
And this week we've got Gordon Brown picking holes in universal credit reforms that you brought in, which are going to hit people quite soon. Some of those people will be saying, what have I got to lose? And might feel like following leaders promising all sorts of things, have been put in dire circumstances or about to be because of reforms that you kicked off.
Without getting into all the specifics of the debate, because I'm not, as I said, I'm not a frontline politician.
But these universal credit changes
no one
about.
thinks that the welfare system was working particularly well a decade ago. Universal credit was introduced by a coalition government in order to incentivise work, make sure that people weren't in these sort of very arbitrary high rates of taxation in effect if they took an extra hour's work. There's a bigger question, which is, it's all very well saying, let's spend a lot more money on welfare, let's spend a lot more money on the health service, let's spend a lot more money on the police service, let's spend a lot more money on the army, which is what people are saying at the moment. Great, fine, but who are you going to tax? Now, if the answer is going to be, as it often is in our society, a political debate, let's go after the rich oligarchs, the people who don't pay any tax. Yeah. Of course you can do more to clamp down on tax evasion, but the idea that that is going to fund massive expansions of your welfare state, or just forget it. It's just not. You can get some extra money potentially from that area, but if you want to, in my experience of all those 8 budgets I did, if you want to really increase substantially the amount of money going to universal credit, the health service, whatever, you can either borrow more, and we've been there before in the run-up to the financial crash, and put it off for another generation to sort out, as I was part of having to sort it out, or you have to increase your income tax, your national insurance, your VAT. Those are the 3 big taxes that the British state uses to get most of its money. And everything else is much smaller in comparison in terms of the revenue it brings in. So you can go to your public and say, you know what, actually we need, the 20p rate of income tax is too low, it should be 25p, or the 45p rate of income tax should be 60p or whatever. Right, then you can, okay, fine, do those things, see what happens, see what you do for wealth creation in the country, see what you do for the incomes of working people in the country. But the idea that somehow there's a load of money lying around, it's just not the case. I mean, it never was and never is going to be. We know that. Look, the country learned one thing over the last 15 years, is that there aren't easy answers to these problems.
2 quick last ones. One in my list of things that some people would park at on your doorstep was weaponising statistics, weaponising numbers. And I just wonder what reflection you have when you look back at how all those numbers you threw at the British public in the referendum, how they didn't land, how the bombardment didn't soften up the enemy, didn't work. How you reflect on that, and whether there were mistakes made beforehand in building up a distrust of big numbers, numbers not being delivered when they were promised the rest of it. How do you reflect on what happened there?
Well, I tried to de-weaponise statistics. I would say there's lots of, when you look back at the time I was Chancellor, and I look back at those 6 years, there are lots of things that came and went were part of the day-to-day political debate, but creating an Office for Budget Responsibility that independently produced the budget numbers and a report on the state of the British finances was probably one of the things that is going to most endure and no one dares change. And that was an attempt to create an independent set of numbers over which people could agree. Of course, it's only ever going to be a prediction, and it may not be a correct prediction, but at least it's independently derived and arrived at, and it's not a partisan prediction, which is what you had before. So I was trying to de-weaponise statistics. When it came to forecasts about Brexit, I would observe that there were 2 sets of forecasts made. The first was, what would happen if we vote to leave the EU and we leave immediately and we crash out, and that was the first set of forecasts. Well, in fact, there's a big debate now about what happens if we crash out, and that's 2 years later. There was a second set of forecasts, which was a big Treasury document, which I oversaw, the medium-term forecast for the British economy after we left Brexit. I would note that it is very, very similar to the official forecast of the British government today, 2 years later, to the forecast of the IMF, the OECD, and by the way, since I know the Brexiteer hardliners sort of dismiss all of these international bodies, it's very similar to all the forecasts you get from real participants in the economy who every day are investing in this country and putting their money where their mouth is, which is that the British economy is not going to be as large and as prosperous as it would have been if we voted to remain in the EU. And there's a real example of that in the value of the currency, which is difficult for people to conceive because most people get paid in pounds and they spend in pounds, and so the value of the pound doesn't matter hugely to them. But of course, when you go on holiday, you notice that your pound doesn't go as far in Europe or America. And by the way, you might have noticed that the things we buy from abroad have gone up a bit in price over the last 2 years. That's a real judgment from the world on the economic consequences of the decision which we all collectively took.
You're a very keen historian. Do you think calling that referendum on Brexit, of course many people rejoice at it, to you though, will it go down as one of the worst decisions made?
Well, I was part of a very close, loyal team, and it's actually, I think most people think of politics as full of sort of backstabbing and everyone positioning for the top and no one can trust anyone. In fact, that was not my experience from my 20 years in politics, and some of the friendships I made there were some of the strongest friendships, and the team I worked with in Downing Street in the Treasury was the best team I've ever had the privilege of working with in my life. So we took a decision on the referendum. People know, I think now, that I didn't agree with having a referendum, and I argued my corner in that Conservative cabinet, or the Conservative bit of the cabinet at the time, and with my colleagues, including the Prime Minister. But I lost the argument, and I was a team player who said, right, let's go and now try and win this referendum. And obviously we didn't do that, and maybe there are things we could have, should have done to try and fight a better campaign. But ultimately, I think we were paying the price for a country that had not really been too aware of the benefits of being in the EU and was using the EU to blame itself for a whole load of questions which are really difficult around immigration and the level of public services and the like, which is not really that much to do with the EU. They're really in our own hands, and now we have taken back control. I can't help noticing that we don't really want to take the decision and we keep pushing it off.
Final question. This podcast is called Politics Where Next. I could ask you, where next, ? Politics. Would you go back?
Well, I don't say no, because I think it's a bit foolish to rule things out. But I had a very good time in politics, and now I'm having a very good time editing this newspaper, which is great fun. And I have learned one thing, which is, maybe I've learned other things, but one of the things I've learned is that you can't, there are many ways to shape our society and have a view and a role in where we go next. And some, of course, that comes from sitting in the, you can do that by sitting on the green benches in the House of Commons, sitting around the cabinet table. I was lucky enough to do that. But editing a newspaper with a great team of journalists, doing podcasts, Gary, it's all part of the conversation we have as a society about how 65 million people on this island are going to rub along together in the future.
George Osborne, thank you very much indeed. Thank you for listening, and there'll be more of these podcasts regularly, we hope, on a Friday. Goodbye.